Hello there, welcome to another little quick easy tutorial where I just use normal things that you find around in the home to make gorgeous, fabulous, arty gorgeousness with. So today I'm just going to be using some photocopy paper, just cheap printer paper, that really cheap crappy stuff that you get, you know, for your computer. And we're going to turn that into something that looks very exotic by using oil pastels or coloured crayons, you know, just wax crayons. And we're just I'm going to show you how to texture the paper so it's an interesting surface to work on rather than just working on a flat piece of paper. So enjoy. So here we go, I've just got some flimsy cheap photocopy paper, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do that and then undo that. And as you can see, it's kind of textured it already. It's got a nice, if you can see that, it's got a nice kind of crackly, crumply surface. So I'm just going to do that once more and crumple it up and carefully undo it. You need to be careful when you're uncrumpling it, because it actually does rip the paper up pretty easily. And the interesting thing is, if you keep doing this, your paper does some very interesting things. And so I might just quickly use this piece and show you how that happens, how that works. So here we go. I've got a piece here that I've really scrunched up and unscrunched, and I've done it several times. The more you do it, the more this interesting thing happens to the paper. It starts to feel really quite soft, and if you've got a very strong light, you can see how the paper is starting to break down. You'll see little bits of paper fibre, little bits of cellulose that the paper is made out of starting to come away. It actually makes your fingers start feeling a bit dusty, and so if you're asthmatic, be careful doing this. This is probably not the best thing, but it feels now like blotting paper. It feels slightly thicker. You know, it started like this, and now look what's happened as well. It's actually got smaller. It's bulking up, it's actually expanding upwards, and it's pulling the edges in. So it looks like it's shrinking, but it's actually just getting a bit fatter. The other thing that this does is it really affects the way that paint takes on the paper. It's got this really lovely kind of almost like watercolour paper now. It's much more absorbent. It's almost kind of fluffy. And you can see, I don't know whether you can see that, but it's got a lovely texture to it. So I'm going to use this now to do some oil pastels on. I'm just going to do a really abstract one. I'm just going to use this piece that I didn't scrunch up quite as much, first of all, because this one's got a bit of a kind of tougher, crinkly, wrinkly finish than that one. So we'll have a go. I'll just show you a few nice ways of, these are oil pastels. They're very soft, which is ideal for what we're going to be doing. But you can just use normal Crayola, you know, pencil crayons. They'll be just as good. You just have to be a bit firmer with them because they're not quite as soft. But if you watch what I'm going to do now, I'm using the side of the crayon, and I don't know whether you can see that, but it's highlighting all that lovely texture. It's just kind of drawing where the paper is raised. So I'm going to do that with a few colours. I need to press moderately firmly, because if you don't press it firmly enough, it won't paint on, it won't draw on. So I'm just going to do something quite basic just to show you some of the effects that we can get out of it. So I expect you to do something accomplished and exciting. Great. You can see there how lovely the texture is. The other thing that you can do is you can layer two colours as well. So you can say do that orange, and then I can get some other colour on top of it. Scraping the paper off this oil pastel. So we get a kind of two-tone thing going on. No, I'm going to scrape off a bit more of this paper. Rather annoying. In fact, I'm going to snap it. There we go. Much better. And let's have a look for the last one. I want a purple. I've got a purple. Actually, no. I'll use a white. Quick change of mind there. White's kind of interesting. Although when you put it on you can't see it. Hopefully when we paint over it with some ink it'll show up. So what I'm going to do now is I've got these things called Brusho inks. They're just a water soluble ink, and but you can use watercolour, you can use watered down acrylic paint. It really doesn't matter. As long as it's water based and you've thinned it down. You can even use food colouring, which is brilliant. Food colouring I think is the best for this, because it's usually quite sharp colours, and they're very transparent. You can see through them really easily. So they're great, they're absolutely brilliant. Getting a bit low on some of these, I might have to put some more ink out. Anyway, I've got this red here. I don't know why I'm using this brush because it's not really suitable, but you can see what happens. There we go. Let me just get another brush. Alright, here we go. We've got a better brush now. So I'm painting over with contrasting colours. I'm not just using a colour that's the same as what I've put on. And can you see it's all kind of beading, and it's not painting on very evenly, which is fantastic when it dries. This is where we did the white. So I'm hoping when I put this on, painting on a dark green, and you can see it's giving me this kind of lovely mottled finish. Yeah? And let's have a look. A bit short of colours here, I need to get some more colours. Right, there we go. I've mixed some more colours now, so we've got a bit more scope. So, let's put some of that red on this orange. And the nice thing is about these is you don't just have to use one colour. You can blend them, mix them, and get much more interesting things going on. Just clean my brush. Important to do that with Brusho because they contaminate really easily. So get some of that green and this red. Very striking. And for this blue, let's put some yellow on that, eh? I love what's happening on the edges of these. They're kind of blending in, look. So we're getting some lovely kind of gradients from one colour, from one tint to another. Hope you can see this. I hope you can see some of the lovely textures that are coming out. So if you're into crafting and card making, these make fabulous backgrounds for text or sticking other things on. So I don't know, you might put out a lovely heart shape, which of course I wouldn't because I'm not sentimental like that at all. but you could cut out a lovely heart shape and stick it on top of that other background, and you'll get some really lovely combinations of tones. This is black, which I really like, and I'm going to put that on yellow because that's a kind of waspish, dangerous combination, isn't it? That very hot, fizzy yellow and then black over the top of it. And I'm hoping when this dries, some of that yellow will show through a bit better than it is at the moment, because it's kind of disappeared, hasn't it, the yellow? But that's all the fun of this process. It's rather unpredictable and you never know what you're going to get. So I'm going to let this dry now. I've just got a bit of bleeding there where the black has gone into the yellow. I've just washed my paintbrush and dried it, and you can see that the capillary action of the brush, it just absorbs all that. I'm just going to put a tad more yellow there because it's a bit of a bald patch. And there you go. So I'll just give you a close-up of some of those. Oops, look at that, how uncanny. A heart just fell on it. I hope you can see this. I hope you can see some of the nice textures that are coming through. Really beautiful. So, well worth playing around with. And I'm just going to let that dry now, and while that's drying I'm going to play around with another piece of paper and do something slightly different. So here we go. I've got a little bit of paper that was scrunched up earlier, and this is just begging for me to do something lovely on it. And I'm going to use this to make a kind of abstract landscape. I'm just going to play around with it and see what happens. It might go horribly wrong, and so you might not see it. I might not post it up, but I've got a good idea that it'll be okay. So I'm just going to use some chalks to kind of draw in. It's quite hard to draw on when it's in this state, because remember, this paper has been scrunched and unscrunched quite heavily. So I'm just going to draw a kind of landscape on here. There's a horizon. Of course it's going to be the Yorkshire Dales because that's where I go all the time. And so I'm just putting some layers in. We'll have some fields in the foreground. So I'm just layering it, because when you're out in the Yorkshire Dales you can get this lovely effect of layering. And I'm going to put some fields in. These are going to be kind of dry stone walls, and I'm going to make it look like they're receding, and we'll make those hills in the background look gorgeous and far away. I'm also going to just use some white to mask out some areas that will hopefully look a bit cloud-like. So I'm just, oh no, look, I've contaminated it. I've got a blood in the sky. But not to worry, hopefully we can work with that. As you know, I'm not a perfectionist, and sometimes those little accidents can have very interesting side effects that are actually quite useful, so it's worth going with them and not getting too upset by them. So I've now got these hillsides. I'm going to put some greens in this foreground. I could do the really pale green actually. A bit rubbish is the set of pastels, it hasn't got a pale green. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine a couple of colours. So I'll put some yellow on, and then I'm going to put some green over the top of it. So that kind of yellowy brown on there. I've got some yellow there. I think I'm going to get some yellow there because that will look like buttercups, I hope. Oh, ripped a bit there because it's all wet, but not to worry because that won't affect the finished product at all. And I'm going to put this on as a stripy background, a stripy field, like it's been mown, like they've had a wheat harvest or something. And let's do one that's, oh, that's a better green. So I'm just playing around with textures. I want this when it's finished to look like some fields in the foreground and then some hills in the distance, some heathery hills. I'm going to put some of this kind of purpley pink on, which I think will give that illusion of heathery hills, the heather flowering in the distance. So of course as things recede in the distance they get paler and the colours drain out a little bit, so you want to be looking at greys and paler colours in these backgrounds. But I think that's going to be okay. That's all I'm going to do. And now I'm going to use some of these Brush-O inks to put a little bit of colour on. And a good tip with these Brush-O inks is water them down a little bit. Don't use them too strong. So I'm going to do some of these bits in the background first. I'm just going to do those hills. The nice thing about Brush-O inks and watercolours and water-based paints is if you use them watery first of all, you can just kind of work out your shapes and your colours without it being too overwhelming. And because if you put too much on too soon, you're going to end up with it really difficult to modify. It's quite hard to take these colours off once they're on. So what I'm doing is I'm just painting these on lightly, and you can always put more colour on, but it's actually quite hard to take it off. So I'm just building up some colour here. Nice and soft. Water that down, it's a bit too strong. So we've got our further hills there, furthest away. You can see I'm not too bothered about them looking fabulous and perfect just yet. And remember, this is an abstracted landscape, so it doesn't have to be completely perfect. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start painting in some of these fields in the foreground. Notice how I'm not using a tiny little brush. I quite like using a big chunky brush for stuff like this. It's just a bit more satisfying to paint with a chunky brush. And it doesn't quite give you the control that a thinner brush would give you, and I like that. I like the fact that it's slightly out of control and you get unexpected things happening. And so you can see now I'm starting to get some really nice textures. Well, I hope you can see this. I hope you can see that it's not going on hugely evenly, and I'm getting some nice textures with this crinkly. It's almost like painting on kitchen towel, or dare I say it, toilet paper. It's very flimsy and thin, but it's quite lovely. And I'm mixing quite weird shades, or I'm trying to, you know, I'm just using this pot here to mix these quite greyish greens and lovely variants. So I've just started to get some of those fields in. You can see hopefully where, I think that camera's a bit far away today, isn't it? But you can see where I'm getting all this lovely texture, and you can see the oil pastel coming through. And I'm not bothered about that rip, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to mount this when I've finished. Let me see if I can get this camera a bit lower. I'm going to have a look at the sky now. So if you remember, I had oh, hang on, another thing. Look at my water, it's gone this really kind of murky pond green, which I don't want. If your water is dirty, it will really quickly taint the colours that you're putting on. So you don't want that, do you? So try and keep your water as clean as possible, and that means you might have to change it every now and again. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually brush the sky with just some water, because I don't want the colour to go on too heavily. So what I'm doing is I'm just going to wet it first of all. Just be really careful with your paper, because it's quite fragile and rips easily. Put an extra dab of water on over where that red is, because we can maybe get that to bleed out a little bit and be a bit invisible. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to get some of this blue. I think this is blue. Is that blue? I don't know what colour that is. Looks a bit purple to me. Just hang on, I'm just going to have to mix up a little blue, because I haven't got any blue. I've got some purple. I don't really want too purpley sky. So I've got some Prussian blue here. These brushos are amazing. I don't know whether anybody's seen brusho before, but some people have. Brusho, you can buy them on eBay, you can buy them from any art supplier online. They come in little pots, and they're great. They come in all sorts of every colour. You can get loads of different types of packs of them as well, and you just add a little bit of water to them and it brings them to life. Now I want this quite watery, I don't want it too strong, and I'm just going to put that on with lots of water so that it doesn't make it look too heavy. And I'm going to do the sky, the highest sky first, because I want to make a gradient. So I want it quite dark, not dark, but I want it more blue than it's going to be on the horizon. Sorry about that, my camera just died. Not enough memory, so I'm on another phone now. So as you can see, I've got this gradient now in my sky, and you can see where I've done my very abstract looking clouds. They look like a cross between jet trails and cirrus clouds, and I'm just using this slightly creamy colour. It's like a kind of, I don't know whether you can see that, it's like a kind of sepia colour. I'm just dabbing a little bit of that on and trailing it through. Be careful with your paper at this point, because when it's wet it's very fragile and it will very quickly start to break up. So I'm using a nylon synthetic sable brush, just a cheap, they're not expensive, but they're quite good for just, they're a little bit softer than a bristle brush. So I wouldn't recommend using a bristle brush on this, because it really will just drag the paper apart. I'm just going to put a bit of green in there. So I'm going to let that dry for a little while now, because it's looking a bit technical, isn't it, and a bit lurid, and I think we'll capitalise on that and make it even more lurid in a minute. One of the nice things to do is layer your paint. So here I'm putting some yellow on top of that green, and I quite like, just building up ever more complex textures and colour combinations, and it gives you a really lovely, satisfying effect. So you can see now I'm building up, rather than putting a heavy colour on to start with. I'm just building up these textures and building up the colour, and getting some lovely kind of textures and fabulous colours out of them. Just going to turn down that yellow a bit. I don't know whether you can see some of these textures, but they're really lovely. Really kind of delicious textures. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put some what we call low lights on these mountains in the distance. So I'm going to use some darker tones just to bring out some of those shapes of the hills. Can't actually see where I made them. So I'm just using some darker tones here to, let's lift this paper up and get rid of that kink there. Just put that in there, and another one there. And I think there's another one here, isn't there? So what I've done is I've just put some dark on it, and then I'm just getting a wet brush and just tapping that with water. I might use a bigger one actually, so I can get it to bleed in, so I don't have such an obvious line. Hopefully it'll just kind of soften that edge. And I'm going to do it on here as well. I'm just going to mark this out. I'm not going to do a constant line, I'm just going to break that line up a little bit. And if I just blob it and dab it, it starts to give the impression of some kind of trees. So I'm going to get some black and some green and mix them together. And I'm going to just dab that on, because this paper is really quite wet now. So I'm getting some lovely kind of bleeding effects as things just blob out. You have to be careful with it because it can get out of control if you're not careful, but I'm just using a little brush and I'm just dabbing it on, and I'm hoping that it's going to give me a kind of, oh, I've got a great big blue bottle whizzing around now. It's attracted by the countryside. Make them a bit bigger as they get close to you. Another nice combination is if you mix black and yellow together, you get some really lovely greens. So really random. I don't want any order to it or rhythms. Just very random, like hawthorn bushes at the side of the fields. There's actually a bit of purple getting in this now, which is nice. So I'm not bothered about it looking exactly like a field. I just want it to suggest it being a space. And, got to be really careful with this. paper because it's very, very fragile now. You can see actually where it's pulling away there, it's pulling apart. But I'm going to show you how you can salvage that at the end. It's actually quite easy. Oh, didn't mean to put all that yellow there, but never mind. Let's lift some of it off. So I've just wiped my brush and I'm just going to lift some of that off. So I dry my brush, squeeze it out into a cloth, and then just rub that over, just to take some of that off, but it's not too bad. And I'm going to neutralise some of that yellow by putting some purple over the top of it to make it a bit less angry looking. So I am going to leave this now. I'm going to get the hot air dryer out on it and I'm going to dry it for 10 minutes, and then when it's dry I'll show you a few more tips and then I'll show you how to finish it off. So I've dried this out now. This is the underside actually, which is looking quite gorgeous. It's got a much softer, very impressionistic look. On this side the colours are a bit sharper, and I think it looks lovely. I'm not bothered about it being all buckled and lumpy and bumpy. That's not a problem at all, because what I'm going to do next is I'm going to mount it on a stiffer piece of paper with a bit of PVA over the top, and it will hold it all down and make it look completely gorgeous. But before I do that, I'm just going to look at it and just think, right, can I improve on some of the things that I've got here? So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm just going to put some patches of dark brown underneath those trees on here. I'm just dabbing it on. And that will hopefully give the illusion, the suggestion that there's a kind of shadowy bit under the trees, and or some wood for the trunks and branches, and just make it look a little bit more, not naturalistic, but it kind of gives your brain and your eyes a little bit more to chew on and makes it a bit more, hopefully, satisfying. So I'm just using this quite warm brown to just dab on underneath the trees, and I'm being quite, I'm not spreading it on, I'm literally just tapping and dabbing little blobs of it on. You can see the paper, again with that lovely capillary action, pulls it out and gives it, it's quite hard to get very distinct marks on this paper now because it's just like blotting paper. It's great, it's lovely. But I love what's happening here with that hill in the background. You can see it's kind of faded a little bit and giving you a really soft effect. I'm just going to use this to just put some texture on here, you know, and put some suggestion of lumps and bumps and rocks, or let's get some of this bluey greeny black over here and just make it look a bit more interesting. So I'm going to dry this with a hairdryer again. I'm not going to do too much with this now because I think it's almost cooked. So maybe a little bit, just bring that round a bit and just And I think that will do. I think once we've dried this out and got some varnish on it, some PVA on it, it'll look gorgeous. I just want to zoom into some of these textures because they're really lovely. I don't know whether you can see that, but gorgeous textures, gorgeous things going on. I love the way that hill is kind of just receding and looks kind of misty and soft. And I quite like this weird random cloud thing going on that is neither clouds nor jet trails nor whatever. It's just kind of quite lively and interesting looking. Right, I'm going to let that dry again. Right, so I've got a piece of paper here that's bigger, slightly bigger than my composition. And what I'm going to do, it's not paper actually, it's card. It's quite a thick card. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint it over, all over, with some PVA. Quite a good amount of it, I don't want to skimp, because I'm going to use this as a background for my piece of artwork. And if there's not enough glue on it, it'll kind of float above. My painting will float on the background, which is what I don't want. So having lots of glue. And PVA is brilliant because it kind of plasticizes as it dries, because it's an acrylic. It's a water soluble polyvinyl acetate, and as it dries it plasticizes. So it's not very good for the environment really, as PVA. So what I'm doing now is I'm just pressing that on. So we've got all these little sections here, you know, where it's ripped and it's a bit buckled, but actually it's quite nice. They become part of they become a kind of feature of the painting, that it's quite distressed. It fits in with that nice textural finish that you've got. So there we go. And now I'm just going to paint over quite quickly. I don't want to rub it too much, so I need to load up my brush with quite a lot of PVA and just rub it. I don't want to over rub it, because what you'll do is you'll start to move the colour around and it'll start going a bit blurry and the colours might start mingling in with each other. So there we go. And what this does is it sticks it obviously to the background and makes it very sturdy, but it also brings out the colours in the brusho, because the brusho colours fade when they dry. But if you do this, you get lovely bright colours. So that's all covered now. I'm just making sure, especially around the edges, that it's all sealed down. There's no buckled parts. I've got a bit of a crease there. I'm just going to try and flatten that out a little bit. But again, it's part of the texture and the technique that it has creases and bubbles and buckles, and it's quite nice. So I'm going to leave that to dry. It'll probably take overnight to dry because there's quite a lot of PVA on there. But you can already see that the colours are starting to liven up and it's looking very lush. And I'm hoping that by tomorrow, when that's dry, it'll look absolutely gorgeous. And I'll show you then. Right, that's nearly dry. And as you can see, there's some really gorgeous textures on there. It's really interesting how it affects the paper and how the inks work, the paints work on top of that textured surface. But it's lovely. I think it is anyway. I would, because I would say that because I've just made it, haven't I? But I'm sure yours would come out looking lots better than mine because you'll have more time to do it. So enjoy if you do have a go. Enjoy. Just be careful when you do it, PVA it. Don't stick it to the table, because when it starts to dry, if you've gone over the edges of your paper or with a PVA, it'll stick really tightly to the tabletop and rip when you try and take it off. So just be careful with that. But I think that'll look gorgeous in a little frame. Sell that for about, you know, £2,000 or £3,000 at least, I think. And so it's well worth playing around, isn't it? Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that. So that's wax resist on textured paper with a bit of watercolour or ink over the top. Dead simple. And you can do any other thing with it you like. Flowers, portraits, you name it. Have a go. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.